This is Identity at the Center.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
I'm doing great, man. I'm so excited for today's episode. One, because our guest, Scott, is just, he gets it. And the second, I think this overall story is a validation that identity is at the center of cybersecurity.
Yeah, we're going to be talking with Scott Kriz here in a second, but to make it clear, right, this is a sponsored episode. Sponsors like Scott and company from Signal, who have been on a few times now at this point, and now Crowdstrike are really the reason we're able to do what we do. So we definitely appreciate that. So let's go ahead and introduce the man, the myth, the legend, Scott Kriz. He's the GM of Continuous Identity at Crowdstrike. Welcome to Identity at the Center, Scott.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Good to be here.
So a little bit of news, right, for Signal over the last couple of months. You guys joined, Crowdstrike pretty recently. We've had some conversations around that with some of the others, but I think this is the first time, right, you've been on the show with us, so we're pleased to have you here. We want to introduce you to the world, right, who's listening, and why don't we find out a little bit more about your identity background? So let's start there. How did you get into identity? Is it something that you chose, or did it choose you?
Yeah, I think it probably chose me in the form of frustration. And at the time, it was about 2011, and my co-founder and I were working as leads of product and engineering departments at various startups. And the one that we were at was actually building fantasy sport games, which has nothing to do with what we ended up pursuing. And we had a lot of employees coming and going, and we really had a challenge with how people got access to things. And that was really the first, I think, awareness I had that identity was even an industry. And we evaluated a small company called Okta at the time to allow people to easily just sign into the things they need to get to. And they were really early, just raised a Series A. And we thought it was just okay. And we knew that it worked well with Microsoft products, but not with other directories. And we were not a Microsoft shop at the time. So really, it came out of that frustration of no one's doing this well. And as we were packaging up that company to sell it, it was a venture-backed company. My co-founder and I said, why don't we go and see if we can do a better job at what Okta was trying to do? And that was really the start of my adventure into identity.
That's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see how it pays off from them. I guess success is, I'm assuming that's where Signal came from, and that was kind of where things, or are you talking about something else?
Yeah, this was actually a company called Bitium, and Bitium we ran for 6 years and ended up competing directly with Okta. And I remember it was the same month that Okta went filed to go public that we beat them at 2 competitive contracts. One of them was a large insurance company, the other was a large bank. And we really thought things were going well. And when we saw them file to go public, we had no idea what it meant for us. And it ended up that people noticed that this was not just a product and a feature, but it was actually a company and a business. And so to make a long story short, we ended up being pursued by a couple of the largest software companies around and ended up selling the company to Google Cloud. And that was a great 4 years of building identity internally at Google and at all of the Alphabet companies, but also building that standalone product. And this was really focused on authentication, provisioning, and directory. And so that actually predated Signal. The Signal was inspired by a lot of the work that we did at Google.
And I'm thinking that's probably where you met folks like Atul and others.
Yeah, our CTO was working on the CAEP standard. So I just saw a draft in a Google Doc of what he was proposing. And I thought, this seems really simple. And I think that was where it occurred to me that sometimes the most elegant, simplest solutions are actually the hardest to get to. And so, yeah, that's where we met. We met Atul and Eric, my co-founder at Bitium, and I were, working on all these things inside of GCP. He owned directory. We did own the what's now called Google Cloud Identity, and that's their federated authentication product. And I was pulled into internal efforts, which became the inspiration for Signal. It was really recognizing that as many great security things that you can have in place at a company at scale, there still seemed to be something missing. And that was really where the idea for Signal came up.
So let's talk about that something missing. So Signal, if I'm in an elevator with you, Scott, and you have to tell me what Signal does, what is the pitch for that?
Yeah, I think the simple version is that in a world where security is really important, and especially one now with agents making that even more apparent, the only way to really feel like you've secured things the right way is to take a stance of having no standing access to anything. And you can, and making sure that every time you try to get into something, that you're evaluated based on the context that you know. And you could think of that in real world terms, walking into a building, or, how do you get into your car, and having that right context of you are the right person trying to do the right thing. And then making sure that once you've accomplished the thing you were trying to do, or the parameters change that make that thing no longer accessible to you, that in that instant, you're no longer allowed to be accessing it. So it was this really, it was really inspired by what was happening in Hong Kong and China at the time, where Hong Kong was being pulled in very closely to China. And Google had a couple of large buildings and offices inside of Hong Kong. And they wanted to make sure that employees or anyone in the office could not get to customer data unless the customer was also physically located in Hong Kong. And that sounded like an easy thing to do. But when you take into account that there are thousands of different surfaces, it includes infrastructure, applications, CRMs, that was actually a really challenging thing to accomplish. And then I think that led us to really believing that it had to be solved in a larger way that wasn't a one-off where you could drop everything and figure out how to fix that one thing, but how do you create something more to scale? And it was actually surprising to me that nothing in industry existed that we could, find a vendor to buy. And so we ended up doing a lot of work there internally at Alphabet, and that, it got my team all promoted, which was great, but it inspired me to figure out how to solve it on more of a global scale.
So with your long history in this space, how has your viewpoint on identity changed over time? Has there been any sort of significant aha moment or an evolution at some point where you're like, oh, okay, I used to think this and now this is where I'm at?
Yeah, there's been just a lot of evolution. I mean, if you think about what I described as that single sign-on problem of I can't get to what I need to get to, that really came out of enabling people to do their job. And it wasn't really my thought at the time that it was a security product, that identity and security were the same thing. But as it evolved and we started to realize that, yes, it's great to enable people to get their job done. We also realized that you can go too far with that if you're enabling too much access or not removing the access when necessary. So a lot of I'd say it probably wasn't new to people that have been in the industry at the time, but for me personally, moving into this world of philosophical differences between how things should be and not tactics around it, I think was really mind opening, and that really led us to how should the world function. And some of the things that we had looked at people attempting in the past, these weren't new concepts, but there were always technical constraints. And I think productivity and security had always been at ends where, and this another evolution of thought was that they don't have to. You don't have to have the security person creating friction that the user notices. And if you do security correctly and you handle identity correctly, it's actually not creating friction. It's as long as you're doing what you should be doing, it's really a seamless process.
I love how you explain these things, Scott. I was kind of thinking as you were talking, it's like, oh, it all seems so obvious in hindsight, right? But I wanted to kind of pick on something I thought of within your title, which is that you're the GM of continuous identity at CrowdStrike. And by the way, to learn more, go to crowdstrike.com. But this term continuous identity, I was wondering if you could kind of explain that to us.
Yeah, there's been a real evolution in naming, and I think others on this program have probably shared that there's just not enough nouns in identity. And so in that world, how do you define conceptually what you're trying to accomplish? So continuous identity is not a specific use case or a thing. It's a representation of a number of different components of how we think about authentication and access. And so on the access side, being able to be authorized in real time, evaluating levels of context and thinking of it as real ephemeral access where it's for that moment in time to do something specific. And when the parameters are no longer met, when the context changes, being able to revoke that access. So it's a continuous evaluation of what's happening across the company, the telemetry that you get, things that you might consider device posture and when they change, and being able to in real time take action. And you can see that word continuous makes a lot of sense when you think about how we're interacting with those levels of access for users, for non-users, for agents, et cetera.
Yeah, and it feels like that real-time nature of things is what differentiates it from traditional approaches like IGA and PAM, which are kind of, in preparation for or post facto kind of analysis. Would you say that's the main difference between the two? And what is it that you gain by being real time?
Yeah, I think if you look at the buckets that Gartner has put companies in over the past, and you consider PAM and IGA, they were brought about for good reasons. Identity governance really Sarbanes-Oxley, and being able to let auditors look at the logic behind who has access to what, to look at lists and groups of users. That makes a lot of sense. However, as things evolve, you start to recognize that the real function of having the right level of access is really hard to do in a static way. And so what existed 20 years ago made a lot of sense, and we still need that level of compliance, but maybe the compliance changes to looking at the underlying logic of the context that's taken into account for access. And then on the privileged access management side, I find it really interesting that in a post single sign-on world, people are still using some of the older technologies. And what I mean by that is, if you take your typical PAM software vendor, they really view the world that you have multiple identities. One is a privileged identity and one is your own identity. And at the same time, we have single sign-on providers like Bitium, which I built with my co-founder Eric, or Okta and Ping. And they've just now built single sign-on. So we clearly know who the user is. Why would you need to have another set of credentials being checked in and out if you understood the telemetry around why they were trying to get access? So I view PAM as an industry that serves a purpose, but it never evolved along with single sign-on and the modern world. So I think we took a step back when we created Signal, and we said, how should the world work? And I think a lot of large companies were thinking about, how do we evolve our existing architecture versus how do we rethink where we want to be? And that was really the key to how we created something new that solves the same problems as a few other industries, but in a very different way. And we wanted to pull ourselves out of those buckets. And that's where continuous identity, the naming, really came from.
I definitely hear what you had to say about the analyst firms kind of identifying this need. I kind of feel like a lot of times approaches in the market are focused on, solving things with their product, but you guys really take an approach which is, hey, we have to connect to all these different sources for signals for what's going wrong or where we're seeing these compromises. So I think that it was, it created a vacuum where, like, hey, who's going to put together a solution that actually does span this? And I was wondering if that was kind of the market opportunity that led you to solving things in this way, or what, or correct me if I'm thinking about this wrong.
I think when we really recognized it was after building something that worked internally at Alphabet. We wanted to validate that this was actually a problem that the rest of the world had. So going out to chief information security officers in the largest companies we could find and asking them, how are you solving this problem? The answers were pretty much across the board the same thing. That's a really hard problem. We don't know how we're going to solve it. We would imagine that we're going to do the same thing that you did and hire a bunch of people because it's so nuanced and specific. And I think that was one of the biggest challenges, is convincing the market that this was actually achievable. There were a lot of people that said, that sounds amazing. I don't think it's possible. And so it really took a couple of very large customers to prove that it was possible, and to get on the stage at conferences like Identiverse and talk about how they had solved the problem. You almost had to show people that it worked rather than just talk about it, because it seemed theoretically amazing, but logistically not possible. And when you mentioned like pulling in signals, that was specifically the thing that seemed complicated. And the question was always, that sounds great, but where do we start? And so being able to ground it in a very simple use case was where we ended up deploying most of the early solutions.
I want to talk a little bit more about that continuous identity landscape that we've got. First of all, you're preaching to the choir, right? This is a continuous identity friendly show. We've had a lot of discussion around it. For me, where it starts is the data. You need data to generate those signals, and then you need infrastructure and pipelines and messaging, right? And all these different connectivity to then pick up on that kind of stuff. I think there is sometimes a feeling that when we talk about continuous identity, that people think it's just authentication. But I feel like it's more than that. I'm just curious, how do you see sort of that broader landscape? What are the capabilities that fit underneath continuous identity?
Yeah, I think some of the early versions of continuous identity were exactly that. They were just, let's make someone re-authenticate every single thing they do. And when they re-authenticate, we'll look at telemetry and decide, yes, you can get in, yes, you can't. Um, what we realized is that it might be better to sit at the authorization layer. And so you're exactly right that data is a requirement, and good data is a requirement in order to accomplish any goals. And I think that's been the case for authentication as much as it is for authorization. I remember doing deployments for single sign-on for those large companies that we won against Okta, and even then, the quality of data in Active Directory was the gating factor for when they were able to actually sensibly deploy a single sign-on solution. And now that I think that companies have emerged and they're further along in their life cycle and their maturity from an identity perspective, it's still data that's the underpinning requirement. And when the way that we usually go about this to think about how can we solve problems and how can we become outcome based, like selling identity products is not interesting. Selling the results is what's really interesting. And so when we talked about with early customers, let's get you to no one has standing access to your cloud infrastructure, and they only have access if someone is on call and they have a support ticket assigned to them and their device is compliant. And they said, okay, well, that's interesting, but how do we get that data? And what we ended up doing was figuring out that most initial policies were very deterministic, and you could write them down on a piece of paper. And there was usually someone in the company that said, I would love to have this deployed. I just don't know how that we would do this technically. And existing solutions don't work. So we basically took those policies, and in that example that I mentioned for a DevOps engineer that needs a ticket and on call and compliant device, we'd figure out, well, where are the systems of record that have that data, and how do we pull those into a central place? And then by doing that, we could essentially say that a policy like that, all it really was a query across a database of deciding whether or not the parameters were met. Now you can change that and make it a little bit non-deterministic, but most policies today, you get extremely far on looking at those aspects of the data. And one that came up almost always was device compliance and telemetry coming from the endpoint. And so naturally, we had almost all of our customers, I think very few that were not CrowdStrike customers as well. And we were unknowingly partnering with CrowdStrike just from an integration standpoint, when it really occurred to us that identity and security are following very similar paths here. And so, yeah, so you're right. It started with the data, and the other parts of continuous identity have to do with interoperability. They do have to do with re-auth, but instead of sending someone through the full cycle of going back to their Okta login screen, it might be something more like a push to a mobile device. And this is something that CrowdStrike has as well. So you can tell that a lot of the end to end is really CrowdStrike products. But in addition to that, it's a very partner friendly ecosystem. So if a customer has a preference on something a vendor that they love for whatever reason, it has a better integration, they like the salesperson, it doesn't really matter. Being able to work with the solutions that they want was really important.
So one of the things that I always see when I talk with vendors is the better together story, right? It's like a couple vendors have kind of banded together to be like, hey, we're all buddies and we share stuff, but it's still historically been more of like a proprietary sharing, right? A connector between an IGA and a PAM or whatsoever. You guys have a more interesting story because you're really kind of living the better together story. Yeah. When I talk about continuous identity with folks, it's generally not like a rip and replace. You're not ripping and replacing the investments you've already made in some of these other technologies. what you're doing is you're helping connect those together, and you're using things like shared signals framework and CAEP and risk, right? And a bunch of other stuff that the industry at large has really kind of come together on. How do we want to share information with each other? So I'm curious, does that better together story make sense from my viewpoint, as sort of on the outside looking in?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, every startup, of course, wants to say better together because that's a much easier thing to say than you should consider replacing a technology you've worked with for 10 years for us. And practically speaking, that's not going to happen. If you look at a CyberArk customer as an example, they spent a long time setting up these systems, and they have deep integrations into everything from switches to infrastructure. And so you can't just really yank it out. So I think a lot of it is augmenting existing solutions and making them better. And, slowly does that move things from old platforms to new platforms? Sure, I think it naturally does. And so in the things that you can be the best or the second best vendor, I think you'll end up owning that set of outcomes. But it doesn't mean that you're, full stock replacing something. I think, to be a little bit controversial, I'd say that my view on the existing PAM solutions is they get reduced down to very few things. And I'd say the two things that stick out in my mind are password vaulting and session recording. And the reason that those don't go along with it is people just don't want to build those. They're not interesting. They're not fun. So I think that some of these industries or some of these incumbents get reduced to their, minimum value that won't go away. And I think that's an okay thing. They can evolve in other areas and expand different markets.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking the same thing. Session recording immediately kind of jumped to my mind as like, okay, no one really wants to build that, so why not use that as a product?
Yep.
Is there a reference architecture for continuous identity? I feel like it's still pretty conceptual, and I don't know if there's like a standard yet other than, hey, there's a bunch of data in the middle, and then just like spider webs.
Yeah, I think you're right. It is. Although I will share that the largest customers tend to share what they consider their reference architecture for 2 to 3 years out. And maybe surprisingly, they're very consistent and they're industry agnostic. So, a large automotive company and a large entertainment company at scale, there might be different use cases, but the problems are pretty similar. So we will see a lot of times that there is this reference architecture. There are aspects of it that are known vendors that they don't want to move. There's aspects that are proprietary that they just say, we want to own this piece ourselves. And then they typically have, the newer things that they're looking to solve. And that speaks to the augmenting of existing solutions as well. And so we like to partner with our biggest customers to figure out how do we get the solution that you want. The reference architecture is a map to that. And when we have experience helping one large enterprise move in a direction, we can, without sharing the details of another customer, we can share kind of the learnings of where they might consider moving. And so I think continuous identity is a path that you travel, and we see iterations of identity, and there is no done state in identity. You don't know what's going to happen in 20 years, right? I think 20 years ago, did we know that agents were going to be the number one topic? And then everything was going to be around, well, what is the implication for identity? What's the implication of security? I think you could have hypothetically said that's possible, but until it becomes real, you don't truly know what existing solutions are going to be durable and which ones are going to be more brittle.
Scott, when I think back to what you talked about in the beginning of our discussion was a real emphasis on in real time. And when I think about real time, I think about authentication. We spoke to Andy Hindle recently. He's the conference chair over at Identiverse. And we said, last year you told us that authentication was done, right? That was the big statement. And do you still believe that? And I'm paraphrasing here. Essentially, he said, probably on the human side, it's incremental progress from here. But if you think about the two big things that are happening, it's non-humans and AI, and it's continuous identity. And then he went on to kind of link the importance of the two, and it totally was a light bulb moment for me. Because if you think about non-humans, if you think about how they authenticate, you can't add MFA. You can only go so far in like kind of improving the way those things authenticate. But you can use signals, and you can use kind of like, hey, this thing, this non-human is doing things it's not supposed to be doing, and it might be the answer to not only improve human access, which is probably like the where a lot of the incremental goes from here beyond like passkeys and things, but also it becomes the path to make authentication an important event for non-humans. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think the dynamics totally changed with humans creating agents and then even agents spinning up other agents. And so, uh, and then it's compounded a little bit by where do these things exist? Do they actually exist on the endpoint? Do they exist on your computer, or are they in containers? Are they in the cloud? And so, um, I think there's going to be some fundamental rules that people create for themselves around who can create an agent, or does an agent have to be attributed down to the user that was the origin, even if it was spun up by the second or third level agent. And then on the authentication side, I think it changes the dynamic to leverage a lot more of the standards that were, I think, interesting but never deployed in production for most companies. And so it's things like SPIFFE and SPIRE that allow you to do create tokens and do identity chaining, where you can understand exactly the path that led to an agent being created and the permissions that go along with that. Do they inherit user permissions? Do agents inherit other agents? Can agents be loaned to other people? Is it an org structure and they just happen to not be human? So there's a lot of these, I think, conceptual things that, in the next 6 months to 12 months, I think we're going to see real solutions. It's fascinating that a lot of the concepts that are enabling this to actually have a roadmap that makes sense, they've been done. But for whatever reason, they were never a priority for the human use case. And to take that a little bit further, when we started talking about the MCP gateway, which every company now seems to have an MCP gateway, and what we could do for agents, that really got conversations with some of the largest companies in the world. And when they sat down with us and learned about it, they learned about continuous identity, because that really is the key to putting this in the right spot where there's no standing access to anything. Everything's contextual. But inevitably, what the next step would be a different conversation around, wait a minute, shouldn't we be doing this for our human users as well? So I think we have some catching up to do in the user identity space. And I believe that is going even faster, because the problems that occur not doing it are very obvious when you take the scale and efficiency and persistence of agents.
You mentioned so many different and interesting use cases there, and you said next 3 to 6 months, these things will get figured out. My question then I started to wonder was, well, who figures it out? Is it those folks on the frontier who are trying to solve this? In other words, the customers are figuring it out? Or are you saying 3 to 6 months down the road, you start to see solutions that are available on the market? Or do you have the opinion, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, that it doesn't matter as long as the signals are strong? You're finding, okay, this agent, whether it's a human or an agent of an agent, doesn't matter, right? The signals should be solving the issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think you will see solutions in the market. Look, when I sat down, we were solving a lot of these problems. When I first met the CEO and president of Crowdstrike in August last year, and we were sitting around talking about the origin story of the companies, it was really amazing to hear that, years ago there was a similar thought process with Crowdstrike building a company that was rethinking how an existing industry existed. I felt like we did the same thing with Signal, rethinking how identity existed. And now I think there's an opportunity with the right mindset to think about what this means for the agentic world. And so maybe the best suited to solve are the ones that have that mindset. Or maybe they're large companies that are experiencing that problem themselves. But I do think there will be solutions in the market in the next 6 to 12 months. It certainly speaks to why identity and security are so tightly coupled today. And I think it just becomes more obvious. So I'm excited about what we're going to see in the next 6 to 12 months.
And that conversation, I would love to have been a fly on the wall, and I'm sure Jeff feels the same way, and the thousands of people listening. I mean, you guys are talking about what your origin stories were, and I'm sure you're talking about what's coming next, right? And it's got to be, a lot of it's got to be about AI and agents. And I actually thought, like, okay, I want to ask a question about, in the AI agent heavy environment, like, what is the impact of continuous? But I almost think that every environment becomes AI agent heavy in the future. So this is the path. And it seems to me, I mean, just as an observer, that this kind of concept around signals is the only path that kind of makes sense. It's kind of like you've seen this big shift in the identity market away from kind of controls that mimic paper and pencil processes. Like, if we didn't have computers, right, identity governance and privileged access management would be on like a paper ledger. But the shift in the industry is now toward real time. That's what excites me about it. But um, anything I said there that you want to comment on?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think we're realizing that when you build products for the problem today, you are either intentionally or unintentionally building brittle products. And it reminds me also of I grew up outside of Boston, and there was a project going on the entire time I was growing up, and it was called the Big Dig. And if you haven't heard of the Big Dig,
Oh, of course we have.
so it's, they and what they realized when it got completed, and it was, they buried the freeway under Boston and then tore down the really ugly green overpass. What they realized pretty quickly was that there was still a really big traffic problem, and the reason for that is that they designed the new project for the population of the city when they designed the project. And so I think that's a lot of what's been happening with these stopgap solutions, and they haven't been thought of as future-proof. So I think the incumbents who have thought about future-proofing and have thought about concept versus just build the fastest thing you can to solve the problem that we realize today are going to be in a tough spot. And I think companies like Crowdstrike, who the origin of the company is thinking about how the world should be, not what's the next step in the process. I think they're well suited to address a lot of these problems.
So let's talk a little bit about Crowdstrike, because I think most people are probably familiar with them from, device management, endpoint management, right? And sort of being sort of on the edge of things. How does identity fit into that broader strategy of being able to secure not only devices, but maybe the identities that live on those devices?
Yeah, it's a foundational part, either knowingly or unknowingly. I think, security is about identities doing specific things, right? So whether that identity is an adversary that, is a nation state or a group of hackers from Russia, like those have identities, and what they're doing is they're usually assuming the identity of another user to accomplish some behavior. And so I think that the behind the scenes has always been security has always been identity centric. And so the realization that these things are just different sides of the same coin is now becoming obvious. And if you pay attention to what's happening even in large organizations to their org structures, you're seeing a lot of, budgets are now identity security, and there's identity security groups, and those titles exist. And I think that was like, for a lot of people, a new and interesting thing. But these things are so, if you think about the purpose of identity, it revolves around security. And, you could get into the religious argument as, is it all identity or is it all security? It doesn't really matter. It's all solving the same problems, which is making sure that, the right people or right identities, whether it's machine or agent, can only do the things that they're supposed to. And I think the other part is when identities are being run by another identity, making sure that lateral movement is something that can be addressed. And those are kind of, known problems that just get a lot worse with the new concept of what people are trying to do with agents.
So it's only been a couple of months since Signal joined CrowdStrike. Have you had a chance to sort of dig into like telemetry data and maybe things that maybe you didn't have access to before and start to inform on like where are you able to maybe leverage some of those capabilities into where things go next for you?
Amazingly enough, we had that level of access pre-acquisition, and I think that's one of the reasons why we love the idea of joining forces with CrowdStrike is that we talked a little bit about the better together story, but I think it really does exist. And I've met so many different startups now that call me and they reach out and they say, "Hey, I would love to get in touch with you now that you're part of CrowdStrike." We've already done integration with these different systems, whether it be the next gen SIM or whether it be through getting telemetry data or device posture. And so it really occurred to me that um, we already had access to the things we need to, and that even was a stronger reason for us to have that acquisition conversation, because that is, in my opinion, the right way to see the world is focus on the things that you're good at and enable the rest of the ecosystem to augment or provide where you might not be the number one or number two. And so um, and ultimately that comes down to an intense focus on what the customer wants and the solutions that they want to deliver, um, versus just we want to sell everything to everyone and our competitors should never sell anything. I think, in a lot of cases, our competitors coexist. Um, Although there's definitely, mutually exclusive technology. And of course we like to work with the best customers. And like any company, right? Like when you're all in on something, you do have some benefit of the connective tissue that goes along with that. Um, so yeah, it's been a great 3 months, and I haven't like uncovered something super secret that the world doesn't know about, but I think that's a good thing. I think that there's it's still really amazes me that CrowdStrike has such an intense focus on protecting their customers, and the level of talent um, is is amazing. And like this is actually similar to when I joined Google. I have no problem uploading all of my personal information to things that are managed by Google. I have a lot of faith in their ability to execute, and they're one of the biggest targets because of that. But I still have that level of trust. And I think joining CrowdStrike, it's really refreshing to have that kind of similar experience where I say, you know, um, in fact, we were not a CrowdStrike customer. Granted, we were only 50 people or so, but it makes me think maybe we should have been a CrowdStrike customer.
You mentioned just recently here, you were talking about budgets and how identity and security have sort of gotten intertwined. Look, you're on the Identity Center podcast, so we're identity people. We're also identity security people. What is it that you think has really kind of shifted the mindset from that budget cycle and that budget allocation to say, oh, to do security, we do need to tackle identity? Is there something you can point back to? Was it like, the many, many reports over the last decade that all say like 80% of breaches are because of identity? Or is it something else maybe that I'm just not picking up on?
Yeah, I mean, selling identity and security is one of those things where when you talk to the people that are boots on the ground actually doing the work, they're going to want to buy everything because the more secure, the better it is. But at the end of the day, I think there's a real ROI calculation that comes into buying anything in identity or anything in security. And with the level of breaches and the consequence of a breach, um, that's real dollars. So I don't think that this is like all of a sudden everyone wants to just be more secure. They're recognizing that there's real evidence in companies that have even done the best solutions and bought from the best vendors where bad things can still happen. And that could be internal malicious. It could be, I think in the future, there'll be some interesting AIs that are doing funky things. So I think the evolution is more just it's become more obvious that this is just tied to the business, and it's not just we need to be more secure. And so to that end, like, you hear things about mythos and what if code isn't hardened the way that it should be? And I think it's amazing technology, and that's all real. But I would also return to like, are you really going to have a hacker spending $4 million on tokens in order to exploit like, a small org structure and email addresses? Like, probably not, right? So there's a big like prioritization exercise that occurs in like, okay, we can do a lot of interesting things, but what's the reality? And I think that's a big way to look at like both identity and security is from an ROI perspective. And moreover, I think the successful companies, and CrowdStrike and Signal being one of those, we're not just focused on on revenue generating for the sake of growing the company. It's more about the outcome based. And I think that, there will be budgets moving from things like the existing incumbent industries over into a solution. And I hope that that means the customer also saves money in addition to having less vendors to manage.
One of the things that strikes me about this world that we're living now with agentic and, now we're talking continuous identity is, I think you can brute force the problem when we're working at human scale, right? You can always add more administrators to provision accounts, deprovision accounts, do things like that. You can't really do that in an agentic world where you've got, AIs and all sort of, workload identities and NHIs that are all spinning up and down within a matter of milliseconds. So to get ahead of that, or even just to keep pace, maybe you do need to invest in a certain level of automation.
Yeah. And that's what's happening right now. I think the dust will settle at some point, but right now people are throwing everything they can at trying to solve the problems. And you see that, I think the first place we're all seeing that is the first phase of AI adoption is everyone should use AI in our company. And you hear about judging your employees based on how many tokens they consume. And, that probably is not the right way, but because it's not really efficient. And does that mean that they should be using AI to ask the most expensive model what time of the day it is 20 times a day, just to waste money and show that they're using tokens? But I think it will eventually settle back to what is the actual efficiency that we're gaining out of it? What's the output of an engineer that's using Claude Code as an example? And so to that point, I don't think it's going to be agents running around wild. I think it's going to be, but I do think that it's going to continue to expand. And the more that you connect your agents to data sources and internal systems, the more that you really need to get identity and security right. Because if you don't, you're not even going to have any idea what's happening, and it will just emerge one day and there'll be a catastrophic failure of some type.
I think to kind of continue on with what you're saying, I think we're in this golden age of AI where, most of us have a $20 pro license on all the models, and you can ask unlimited questions. You can just play with the thing as much as you want. The price is still $20, and it's like, that's almost like free. So it's easy to start thinking hey, the hackers are for free just going to send out millions of emails and they're going to do all these things, or that, you're not going to need any kind of software companies because you can just do all these things for free with AI. It's like, well, do you really think it's going to be free? These companies are going to IPO around $1 trillion. It's not going to be free, right, in the long term. And I'm not saying we're being set up or anything. I guess what I'm saying is we're living in this golden age where we get to use these models and we're not paying the value of what actually we're doing, or most of us anyway. I mean, I'm on ChatGPT constantly,
Yeah.
right? And I'm sure they're not making a ton of money on me with what the infrastructure probably costs in the back end. Sorry, total aside but you got me thinking there. But I did want to ask, because I've talked to a lot of folks who had a CrowdStrike infrastructure, and they always thought about it, this pre-Signal, they always thought about it as part of their identity architecture, part of their identity solution. So the way I wanted to ask this question was, what did the Signal acquisition mean to CrowdStrike? But also, what did the CrowdStrike acquisition mean to Signal?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, the CrowdStrike was starting to do a lot in identity, and obviously identity was the underpinning of a lot of the security controls. One of the examples that I would give that was pretty common is based on device compliance or on telemetry. CrowdStrike already had the ability to brick a machine or to log someone out of Entra, right? And so that's a valuable piece of functionality because it really does stop the lateral movement or the spread of a breach, because it actually takes whoever's sitting in front of that machine at that time, they can't do anything at all. But that does get in the way of business. And so I think a lot of the early use cases that we had were kind of being the scalpel to that sledgehammer, where you could say, if we're detecting something specific, or if a device changes compliance by a specific amount, then what we're going to do is set a policy, and those policies can be customized by the customer that says, remove them from every bit of production infrastructure that they have access to and make sure they can't get back into it, but leave access to Slack and email because we want them to be able to remediate without having to take that computer and put it into a UPS box and send it back to the office and not be able to work for 3 days. So that's kind of, the beginning of that better together value that our customers were seeing. What it means for Signal is really exposure to an enormous customer base that is our exact target market. And when I mentioned before that our early customers, we'd have to convince that this wasn't magic, that this actually does work. It does help to have customers telling that story, and we were off to a great start doing that. This just adds more validation to what we were building, and I think the customers that have trusted CrowdStrike in the past and continue to look at this as an opportunity to gain functionality from an existing vendor versus, I think a lot of the comparable solutions are just other startups trying to solve these problems. The less so the customers of CyberArk as an example, because that's still it's an older product for an older purpose. So I don't know that they viewed that as the real competition here, but like I said, I'll call it out. We do a better job at protecting infrastructure than those PAM providers, and so I think we will see natural migration now that we are part of a large public company, and the credibility that comes along with that with customers that are saying yes, we would prefer to work with CrowdStrike on that.
Yeah, I kind of think, this is my perspective, is that having the CrowdStrike name kind of lends some credibility from the standpoint that their customers obviously trust them. So they're now going to open the door, listen to the story. But I always felt that Signal had a strong enough story standing on its own. I guess what I'm also wondering is, are there actually features or capabilities that Signal brings to the table that are actually going to change or impact what would have been the Signal roadmap or product strategy?
Yeah, I think we're following the same roadmap that we were as an independent, but with the advantage of being a larger company. So I don't think there's much roadmap change there. And the question about the standalone, it was probably the hardest decision of my career to decide that we wanted to go ahead and agree to be acquired. We did not seek out acquisition. We were not looking to be acquired. Everyone in the company was so passionate about innovating and solving a problem in a new way that, it's, yes, of course, businesses are there to generate profits and to pay back investors and return multiples on their money. And that's a consideration, but it was a really hard decision. And when we went through and learned more about the values of CrowdStrike as a company, the technology, the leadership, it became a real consideration. I think, we were actually pretty surprised that we even went down that route. And so I think that speaks to what, how we view CrowdStrike as a company, the values, the technology, the people, the opportunity, that we were really willing to, take what we thought was an amazing trajectory, and our investors thought we were on an amazing trajectory too. And to say, maybe it's better to fulfill the promise of what we're trying to achieve with a company that has this type of footprint, capabilities, values, and trajectory as a public company. So it was a hard decision, but I can say after 3 months across the board, my team is very happy about where we landed, and we feel like George, the CEO, always talks about when they went public that was the green flag, not the checkered flag. He's a big F1 person. I feel the same about the acquisition. It wasn't a destination. It was really the start to a new race. And so that's a pretty consistent, it's the consistent feedback I've received from everyone on the team.
I love that. And I sense that enthusiasm and excitement for the future from you. It's not like, hey, we've made it and I'm going to just move to the beach and, park my butt in a chair or something like that. You're personally, I feel like, invested in, obviously I don't want to speak for you, but
Yeah.
that's what I'm hearing.
That's right.
I wanted to ask one more question before we wrap up. You had talked a little bit earlier about how you were seeing some of your clients where they had um, line items in their budget for identity security. And I thought to myself, yeah, I've seen that. And the bigger one that I've seen is zero trust, where it's like, hey, we've got a zero trust budget. Now we're going to pursue zero trust. And it feels to me like this is the epicenter of zero trust. And I'm wondering, like, do you see the same thing? And you talked a little bit about like customers building their own architecture, and CrowdStrike is a piece of that. It seems to me like Signal's a piece of that as well. What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely I feel like we are a fundamental component to what companies see as their architecture and where they want to go in the future. And again, that's another reason why I think we're so tightly aligned with how CrowdStrike approaches their customers and the value that they provide to them.
I also just wanted to say one other thing, which is I think zero trust gets the knock that it's just another buzz term. Like, hey, our product now is 100% more zero trust. And
Yeah,
I get that because the terminology gets abused. It's kind of like identity security, honestly. It's like, hey, we're now an identity security product. It's like, what, last year you weren't? It's just an industry buzz term, but it does have a real meaning behind it. And I think zero trust is probably one of the most important cybersecurity architectural frameworks or approaches that we've come up with. So even though it's kind of like fun to poke at, I think it's a real thing.
yeah, it's a real thing. I think the reason it's fun to poke at is like I said earlier with the not enough nouns in identity. When you say something like zero trust, and all of a sudden there is budget in an enterprise that's under a zero trust moniker, every startup and every vendor on the planet all of a sudden now has a zero trust solution. And so, in addition to being accurate, it also creates, unfortunately, a lot of noise in the market. Um, you know, Startups specifically are very scrappy. So when they hear there's a budget and they can kind of put a name to what their product is, and you're seeing this with AI now, right? People are like, even if they're not an AI native company, it's always AI. And so I agree with you that zero trust is a huge, or zero standing privilege is a huge component of the industry. I think we need to be careful about making sure we test the vendors to make sure that they actually fall in the category versus just something to align to a budget.
I'm looking forward to an RSA next year or some other big conference where every vendor is the zero trust agentic identity, blockchain based cloud security multi-guard solution, right?
Well, I mean,
Every
Identiverse is
single
coming
term.
up. Yeah, Identiverse. I'll be curious because typically, Identiverse tends to be mostly practitioners and real identity folks, and so I'm curious who's trying to pitch the primarily AI angle versus solutions based outcomes.
I've seen a ton of AI and agentic security products, right? They've existed for a while, and now on their website they've got some form of agentic security, included. Does that frustrate you when you see like all that out there? Maybe, and it's not even really about the product itself, right? It's the capability. It's the marketing term. Does that get in the way of actually trying to solve the problem?
It doesn't. I think it would frustrate me if I was a buyer looking for a solution, because I'd be like, going up to booths at conferences saying, "Well, what do you actually do?" Like, because you all have the same words everywhere. I think the advantage of being part of a larger company is it's not frustrating because we can talk about outcomes, and then the how you achieve the outcome is the question, and being very clear with the things that you solve versus the things that might be more applicable for other vendors to supply. So I think it's around clarity.
You've been very generous with your time, but this is Identity Center. We always like to end shows on a lighter note. We were kind of getting to know each other yesterday when we were kind of prepping for this and kind of getting in sync. And you mentioned that you get into skiing as something you do in your copious amounts of free time, which I'm sure you have. You mentioned taking helicopters, though, to ski. I've never been skiing at all in any form, or snowboarding for that matter. So the idea of taking a helicopter, I'm guessing up a mountain. Are you jumping out of helicopters, with skis? Are you, a daredevil, kind of person when it comes to that? explain more, like what is it when you talked about taking helicopters and going skiing?
Yeah, and it's not something I do often. I would not suggest it to people that aren't, avid skiers or. And I remember the last time, the last run I took, I was standing next to another guy, and I said, "So you do this every year, huh?" And he said, "Yeah, I do it every year." And I said, "It doesn't seem like it's that dangerous." And he said, "Are you kidding? This is one of the most dangerous things you can do." And I had a little bit of a reflection. So I think being a little bit ignorant to how dangerous it is to even just get into a helicopter, nonetheless get dropped off. And no, I don't jump out of a helicopter, but they give you about 15 seconds to unload, and then another 15 seconds to get back in when you're at the bottom. I don't consider myself a daredevil, although I guess if you look at the things that interest me, maybe they would be in that category. Look, for me, like I'm thinking, and this sounds strange, but I think about identity like almost all the time. I think about security. I think about work. I think about solving problems and what's broken. And for me, like the getting out of a helicopter, getting off a ski lift, it's kind of similar. You're focused on one thing, and whether that's not dying or whether it's just having fun and being in the moment, it's all the same, because it means you're not thinking about the things that occupy your brain most of the time. And so I think that's maybe why I choose activities and things to do that I have no choice but to be 100% present. It's forced on me, because if I start to get distracted, maybe bad things can happen.
Well, you're definitely amongst your people, right? We eat, sleep, and breathe identity all the time as well, since we do this on nights and weekends. I love the idea of thinking about not dying, right? And being, focused on the mission, right? Get down the hill safely or whatever it may be. I mean, I was going to ask, like, what do you think about when you're skiing? Is it technique? Are you solving problems while you're going down the slope? Is it just you're rocking out to, the soundtrack? Like,
Yeah.
tell me, take me inside the mask or the helmet or whatever it is that you're wearing, and kind of put me in your shoes.
I do wear a helmet. Some people do listen to music. I do not. I actually love the sound of the snow, of carving turns. I like the sound of my own breath. And I like being in the moment. So, what I'm generally thinking about is, it's everything that involves what's actually happening at that time. And so, you can only think 2 or 3 turns ahead, but you have to watch out if there's a tree or a cliff and make sure you're not going off of it. The technique and the turns, absolutely. It's in grooming runs, it's going to be like the nuance of how you carve and the actual ski. And when you're in the backcountry, it's more, you're a lot more focused on not going to the dangerous places and falling in tree wells and things like that. But there's nothing more fun than kind of just being alone in nature and drifting down the mountain. I love that it's not a competitive sport. If you're doing it recreationally, it's just something that you're enjoying yourself. And people that I ski with talk about, oh, I need to improve here, I need to do this, or how do I get better at carve? And I always say to them, look, skiing is not a competition. It's one of those things where it's personal and it's about enjoying yourself and being in the moment. So there is in my mind, there's no difference between a good skier and a bad skier, other than maybe if you're a little bit more skilled, you have the ability to get out of your head more and just be in that flow moment.
Yeah, you were talking about like jumping off of cliffs when we found out that you're an avid skier. Here's the way I always looked at it. It's like, I'm not even a good enough skier to do this, right? I think you have to be like an excellent skier, but then there's still things that could kill you. Probably shouldn't put it that way, but like, just think of an avalanche or something, right? That doesn't matter how good of a skier you are. If an avalanche comes, you're toast, right?
Well, I think, there's preparation. So if you know what to do in that situation, you should increase your odds of something bad not happening. Also, like, there's usually guides with you when you're in those situations, and generally they're going before you, which means that they make sure that you're trained, because they're the ones that are going to likely be the person that gets buried, and you're going to have to dig them out. And to be clear, I don't jump off cliffs. That does not interest me. That terrifies me. But even with that, you do encounter spots where you just end up, having to kind of navigate off of one or two.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's I recommend that everyone find something, if you don't already have it, that kind of gets you into the moment, and you don't have to think about death or avalanches. And hopefully you never encounter any of that. I will share that I've only experienced one avalanche, and it was a long time ago in high school on Mount Washington in New Hampshire. And it was at Tuckerman's Ravine, if you know where that is. And there's often avalanches, and there's people sitting on the rocks ready to run up and dig people out. And the closest that I've come is my brother, who was next to me, got kind of buried up to his waist in an avalanche. And it was amazing to me how hard it was to dig him out because that snow is so heavy. And so if that's not enough to scare me into not wanting to be a part of an avalanche, I don't know what is, because it would be absolutely terrifying to be trapped under heavy snow and not knowing if you're going to, be lucky enough to have someone find you with a shovel.
Well, as someone who hasn't skied, I was thinking, oh, this sounds pretty pleasant. And then you had to go and tell that story. And you know what? Now I'm back to, I think the closest I'll get will be, the video game SSX on PlayStation a while back and snowboard down a virtual type of environment.
Well,
so
and Jeff,
thanks for scaring me out of that.
No, I'll tell you, you should try to ski because it is fun. And when you're on a ski hill, it's set up for safety and you're not going to encounter these dangerous things. There's, a lot of people whose full-time jobs are to make sure that everyone's safe and having a good time.
All right. I'll give it a shot. I'll try anything once. So I appreciate that. You've been great and, with your time and sharing all this knowledge with us and kind of getting to know you. So we're going to let you get on with your evening and enjoy it. Thank you so much for being part of the podcast. And we'll have links in our show notes for people to check out. So you can go to crowdstrike.com, learn more about all the cool stuff that Scott and his team are working on. We'll have your LinkedIn connection information as well in our show notes if people want to reach out, ask questions, maybe share, skiing tips, whatever it might be. But we just appreciate that. And thank you again for sponsoring the podcast. It means a lot to us, helps us do this on nights and weekends and everything in between, outside of our day jobs and things like that. So definitely appreciate it. We'll go ahead and wrap it up for this week. Thanks everyone for watching and or listening, and we'll talk with you all in the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com. See you next time on Identity at the Center.